Hi, good afternoon. Thank you so much for joining us today for our webinar on how to ensure risk management keeps up with your data appetite. My name is Shomik Ghosh. I'm Assistant Editor at ADCSO, and I'm glad to be moderating this discussion for you today. Now, by 2025, the global data creation is projected to grow to more than 180 zettabytes. However, when data is not adequately protected, it becomes vulnerable to cyber attacks and data breaches. Furthermore, massive changes in the country's data governance and regulatory compliance, such as the DPDP Act and RBI's regulations on payment system data, has compelled organizations to assess privacy more effectively and build the right trust framework. In this webinar, ETCIO discusses data privacy and trust frameworks with the acclaimed architect of transformational programs across Fortune 500 firms and an accomplished data strategist, a data engineer, and data protection officer, Mr. Tejasvi Adagada, the Senior Vice President and Head of Enterprise Data Management at HDFC. Tejasvi, thank you so much for joining us. It's an absolute pleasure hosting you.
Yeah, the pleasure is mine, Shomik, to be here along with you.
Absolutely.
Thanks for the warm introduction.
Sure. Now, Tejasvi, you've been looking at data from a BFSI point of view. You've also seen a lot of regulations, both from the RBI and the data governance framework unfold in India. You've had a ringside view. Tell us some of the changes that you've been observing. And, as a data protection strategist and a data engineer, what are some of the challenges that you foresee coming up? And how do you plan to be tackling them at your organization at this point?
Yeah, that's a great question, in fact, Shomik. To start off, I would say that, most organizations which are mature on having to consider data as a strategic asset, the way we consider technology as a strategic asset, or people as a strategic asset, organizations are getting to realize the importance of having to count for data as a strategic asset. And that's the reason why we are seeing certain headwind in terms of having to dovetail management of data and its impact on having to govern it as a strategic asset on the corporate governance principles as well as on ESG. Now, if you look at it from a perspective of how the boards of organizations are, teaming up with the rest of the asset owners, in terms of having to give the due recognition to the data officers as well as the privacy officers, we can specifically see that formalizing these functions like data office and a privacy office is in fact a step forward for the industry to manage and govern data as well as its risk of privacy in an active way. Now, when we call that data as well as data privacy and data risk will have to be actively which ourselves are a part of, to be able to cater to the needs as well as the risks associated with data. And that's where, a structure right from the top and the alignment of these functions in the first line of defense or the second line of defense is, and you already said it, we have been seeing regulations as well as if we need to formalize data office as a formal function and a data privacy office as a formal function, the data risk, in fact, is going to be an enabler because every asset, in fact, has a risk associated with it, which in the event in the future, if it manifests itself, is going to impact either the reputation of the organization or, let's say, the provisions that have been set aside for the organization for regulatory purposes. And that's where I see risk to be an enabler of having to formalize data office and data privacy office today.
Right. And Tejasvi, coming to the next part of it, if you could tell us a little bit about how do you go about balancing data consumption with data risk, especially when it comes to the present day enterprise. We know a CISO has certain limitations, certain boundaries, certain responsibilities, and then a DPO has a different set of key deliverables. So how can CIOs, how can CISOs and DPOs actually collaborate better to balance this data consumption with data risk?
That's insightful as a question. So if you ask me, a CISO or a data privacy officer is in fact, you know, interested in having to reduce the threat surface area that an organization can get exposed to. While if you look at the likes of a business intelligence group or a marketing group, who in fact are processing data at scale to be able to derive certain insights, like whom can we market better to, or what is the next best product that can be given to a customer. Now, these are certain use cases which in fact is driving growth for the banks and the organizations. Now, there will have to be a delicate balance between having to process lots of data as well as having to expose this data to a threat surface area. Now, that's where, the enabler functions and the control functions will have to strike this balance, which is quite important. And we have seen even the DPDPA that there are certain guidelines around having to minimize whatever we curate from the customer to curate what is absolutely necessary to be able to service the customer with a legitimate interest or with a consent. So privacy as well as accuracy of the data are significant risks, which have been highlighted in the DPDPA as well.
Right.
Now, the business function along with the risk function or the control functions, including the privacy office and the risk office, wherever they be, in the first line or the second line, will have to come together and start having this trade-off between what needs to be collected from the customer versus what should not really be processed. So if I take a simple example, while I was with my erstwhile bank, on a loan application, we were taking around 400 data points.
Okay.
Now, can we not really process a loan if we don't have 400 data points from the customer? Now, there can be something like a or a city of birth. Now, some of these data elements, are they really required for us to process? Or are they good to have to be able to better service the customer?
Right.
Now, these are certain questions which, in fact, need to be asked back to the business owner. And there is a specific activity which comes out as a part of the privacy regulation, which clearly calls out that, we need to understand the purpose for which we are getting personal data. If we get personal data, is it by having to take a consent from the customer? Are we getting it in the legitimate interest of the customer and the bank or the public good?
Right.
Now, once we are able to establish the purpose, it becomes easier for us to process the data with confidence. So that's a few cents that I can quote, Shamik.
Makes sense. Absolutely. Thank you. And for the audience watching us, I would urge you to share your questions with Tejasvi right now. Now, Tejasvi, do remember that he's not only a veteran data protection officer at HDFC, he's also had a lot of experience at Access prior to that at Ocwen. And most importantly, he is a published author on data management and data risks. So please feel free to share your questions with us in the Q&A box. Moving on to the next topic, Tejasvi, another core point of contention that we've been having is around the data risks, and how do you stem that with the current enterprise technology tools that are available. If you could tell us a little bit, as a follow-up on what kind of tools and technologies do you think are going to be promising to help CISOs and DPOs manage the risk stemming from data?
Yeah, sure. Well, Shamik, I would start off by having to say that, any tool is a good tool.
Okay.
If it is even a spreadsheet where, in fact, we are able to understand what are the future risk events that, probably a bank or an organization is supposed to get into. In an event that, that particular risk event is supposed to happen, what is going to be the business impact? Is there a provision for the bank or the organization to cover itself on the costs that are going to manifest along with the risk manifesting itself?
Okay.
So these are certain questions which need to be asked to the business owners, who in fact are the data owners themselves. So the narrative that needs to be put across in the industry, which needs to come strongly in India as well, which I think is coming today, is the owner of the data is the business themselves.
Got it.
Because the business owner is owning the balance sheet. If let's say we pull up the balance sheet of a bank, we see that liabilities, it was able to make X profitability numbers. Y net profitability out of probably a Z profitability number, gross profitability number. So the business owner owns the balance sheet. Now, business is generated by having to process data, and that's where ownership of data needs to be parked with a business owner, best to be able to take decisions on that particular set of customer data.
Got it.
And that's where we're calling out that the risk owner as well as the privacy owner will have to be the business owners themselves, with the enabler functions like the data office, the privacy office, and the risk office coming together. Will be able to enable these business owners to be able to collectively call out that there is a particular risk associated with collecting customer data. There's a risk associated with not collecting it in the right way. If data, let's say something like, a city of birth, if it is being processed to understand if there is credit worthiness for a customer, if at all there's a purpose for it in such a way, I'm just simulating it.
Okay.
Now, are we collecting the right city of birth, or is the customer being verified for whatever information he is or she is providing? Now, that's accuracy of data. When we go back to regulations, it's clearly stated even in the BCBS or even in the DPDPA, stating that it's important to collectively call out what is the risk event that can happen in the future, and what is the business impact of, let's say, a breach happening on, let's say, certain city of birth of customers, and what are the existing compensatory controls in place. Are we doing anonymization, masking, or is it being encrypted, double encrypted, channel encrypted, the other security practices that come into play? And we are all talking about privacy enhancing technologies. Are these compensatory controls in place? Are we able to call out that we specifically have these encryption techniques which is able to preserve the integrity of the data, but still we are able to process the data without having to go through a breach or exposing it to outside threats?
Understood.
So these compensatory controls will have to be documented in the tool, and an inherent risk rating can be arrived at, let's say on a scale of 1 to 10.
All right.
And once we get to know that these are the top 10 risks within a business division which have the highest probability of occurrence, which have a higher impact on the business balance sheet or on the organization. Now, these top 10 or 20 that contribute to the 80% of the risk will have to be tackled with priority. Now, if there is a tool as simple as an Excel, which is able to collectively have this information together for the business owner, the data privacy and the risk office to have conversations on how to mitigate these risks, then that will be the first tool that can be quite helpful for the organization. Now, most of the organizations, in fact, have inbuilt tools to be able to capture the risk, or we have other partner-based tools like OneTrust, Security.ai, Ardent Privacy, which in fact are privacy management tools, which also can cater as privacy risk management tools that can help with the first step of curating the privacy risk or the data risk or the technology risks that need to be actively managed or mitigated. Now, if we take a step further, there are other risk management tools, specifically in the privacy space,
Right.
which can in fact help us to map the data, to discover the data to start with.
Okay.
We call them data dictionaries or catalogs. We have Informaticas of the world, IBMs of the world. We have many privacy specific partners, which are startups out there in India or the US, who are doing really great at having to discover the data. Because unless we inventory the data today, unless we have an inventory of assets, it becomes really difficult to manage the risk associated with these assets.
That's correct.
And that's the second step, which in fact any organization will have to do in terms of having to pick a tooling that can help inventory the data assets and also inventory the risk associated with those data assets.
Got it. Now, Tejasvi, we used to keep talking about secure by design, and it's still an ongoing conversation. But today there's a little bit of buzz that we're hearing about privacy by design as well. So if you're talking about the shift left approach, how can this be stitched into application building and take privacy into account in addition to security?
Yeah, that's quite intriguing, Soumik. So I'll start off by having to say that in my erstwhile organization, this was the first question which was asked by the CIO back then.
Okay.
Okay. So how do you get to understand which changes in the organization, are associated with data or privacy? Now I started pondering on how do I get to do that. Now there are at least 600 changes that go in a week in the organization, in the bank.
Right.
And that's massive to be able to control.
Mm-hmm.
And how do I get to know by having to go through the 600 changes, which are the ones that have changes to data? By changes to data, I mean new data being collected from the customer. Let's say, something like the current income to be able to give a better card or a better loan as such if the customer has a need, or a better contactability when we need to collect, uh, when we need to go for collections.
Right.
So having to go through the 600 changes is quite daunting. We would need 10 people to do that for us. And this is every week. So that's when I realized that having to introduce a simple field in the change management application, saying that if there is a data change, yes or no,
Mm-hmm.
is something that a change owner will have to put in when having to raise a project or a program or a change request in IT, in technology. So along with technology change, we are getting to club a data change, which in fact has reduced our work to 80%
Mm-hmm.
in terms of having to go through the changes to see if there is data associated with it. If existing data is getting changed, like customer name, when there is a merger, might increase from 35 characters to 40 characters.
Right.
Or let's say a new data field is getting collected. And that is the first step which I would advise to everyone out here, to be able to call out in the project management or the change management application that there should be a field which can capture whether the change is related to data, whether there is privacy of customer getting impacted. In the change owner's own words, sentiments, it's a sentiment based approach. I know it's not completely foolproof, but at least you'll be able to save on 80% of the time that your team spends on.
Correct.
And that in fact got me to limit myself to focus on having to spend time on understanding which changes in fact are going to be privacy based changes, where there needs to be controls for encryption, anonymization, masking, which are privacy enhancing, or where data needs to be discovered using privacy management tools or data governance tools, where quality and accuracy controls need to be put in place, and where in fact architectural changes are required to be actively taken to the architectural committee or the board for certain impact that needs to be controlled. And data security and the information security in fact gets to look at the personal data of the customers that are being added or getting changed for an impact on their further downstream workflows. And business intelligence teams and marketing having to get to understand that there is something new that is getting curated or changed. They probably can use the data if they have a specific purpose or a consent from customers. So one single change is going to impact positively the entire organization. So that's probably a nudge I would give to the audience here.
Understood. Now, Tej, we have been talking to our CISOs and CTOs. There does exist a proper security framework. There's, data protection framework, a risk framework, all of that's right there. But then, given the conditions that we are working in right now, and what's projected to come, how can CISOs or CTOs go about building a trust framework? And what has been your approach to building this framework?
Yeah, Shamik. So I can briefly give my thoughts.
Sure.
Probably my personal views, but I have been able to instantiate this with multiple DPOs and CDOs across the world. Will I be able to share my screen, or do you have a data trust framework which I shared earlier with you to be put on the
Uh,
screen?
You see that green share screen button at the bottom?
Yeah, I can see that.
Yeah.
Let me quickly.
So this framework that you're talking about, Tejasvi, this is something that you built ground up?
Yeah, this is something which I was able to build grounds up.
Brilliant. Okay.
Um,
We can
and
see the screen. Yeah.
yeah, so let me go full screen on this. And what we're looking at is a data trust framework, which in fact has all the aspects that the CX would have to consider, or a data function owners or privacy function owners will have to consider if you are to manage and govern the landscape in totality.
Mhm.
Because we are looking at people, process, technology, which towards our left on the vertical axis
Okay.
are the core pillars of capabilities, and the processors and controllers, who in fact are third party to the organization, are significantly able to impact the risk associated with customers' privacy and the risk associated with data.
Right.
Now, this can be as simple as people who are doing data entry for you
Mhm.
in a branch, or they can be the likes of Bloomberg or writers who are providing you with information like credit rating of a company for you to
Right.
help your clients with wealth management. And people, process, and technology is being widely used across as foundational capabilities. Now, I'll tell you how this started. This is a popular defense mechanism. It's called capability based assessment.
Mhm.
When we plan for any particular change in an organization, it's important to understand that these three pillars come in tandem to be able to ensure that a capability or a change can actually make an impact on the organization or the customer.
Okay.
And towards the top, we in fact have policy, ethics, and ESG,
Mhm.
data governance as the next function, then the privacy office and the privacy management coming as the next function, the database technology, which includes the platform management coming in next,
Right.
the third party management comes next, and records management, which is information management, comes towards the last. But it is still important. So, however, I think now we understand policy. Why do we need a policy to manage data and customers' privacy? Because whenever something is ad hoc, it becomes even challenging for us to have the grassroots employees to follow, as well as to be able to repeat a certain set of activities so that a consistent output or an outcome can be arrived at. So let's say if I have a specific change, if I don't tell a grassroots employee as to which data can be classified as personal data, let's say a demographic of a customer, or let's say anything to do with financial information like a card number, which is PCI DSS,
Mhm.
these nudges need to be coming out in the policy from the function, be it the data office or the privacy office or the CISO's office, to be able to help this activity to be repeated multiple times with ease. So policy helps in having to create that decisioning and accountability framework along with the responsibilities and accountabilities of the employees. If a policy is not able to do that for people, then it's not a good policy. If a policy is able to help the employees do that consistently, it's a good policy. Now, coming to the process.
Yeah.
Now, the policy goes in tandem with the process. When we talk about data governance and privacy by design, Shomik, I know you asked this question earlier. How do we ensure that, we shift privacy, security, and data management early into the change life cycle towards the left,
True.
which means that the business analysts and the data analysts and the privacy analysts who in fact you know get to elicit the requirements from customers, internal IT, or the business divisions, will have to be a part of the needs analysis. Now, whenever we get to analyze a need for a particular change to be done, be it adding a new functionality like CRM or a customer master or an ERP solution. You need to have a process of having to integrate the people, the analysts, right from the needs analysis, which in fact will give that thinking about privacy and data right from the start. Now, while we do that, we can also capture the risks associated with having to, you know, curate this data and process this data right up front while the requirements are being documented. Now, if you ask me, large firms, at least in the US and UK, they have got to a level of maturity where, in fact, they have a data requirement documentation, which is a formal document which is collected along with business requirements.
Okay.
Now, this being introduced, even in the Indian context, I know some of us might be doing it already, but having that formal data requirement documentation will in fact ease this particular process of integrating privacy and governance by design. Now, the next aspect is technology.
Right.
We can talk about the data privacy, security, and IT risk framework, which in fact is an overarching framework that provides the principles by which data risk and privacy risk and security risk can be managed actively. And Shaumik, if you remember, we spoke about having to understand what is a risk event.
True.
And we talked about it to the audience as well, saying that we'll have to capture the impact of a risk event manifesting itself,
Correct.
along with the probability of it having to occur in the future. And then the inherent risk associated with an existing control failing, like an encryption control or a masking control or a consent control,
Right.
or even a data management control like quality control. Now, a framework is important. It needs to be overarching so that it provides a direction to technology. And when it comes to the next aspect, processes and controllers, now there needs to be contracts, which in fact has been highlighted as a part of the data governance aspect, which clearly calls out in the event of certain risk like data risk or security risk or privacy risk, what are the certain steps that need to be taken,
Mm-hmm.
and are they having the right set of compliance standards and ethics to be able to manage a risk event happening at their end. Now, these need to be baked into the contracts that can come through the data governance, data sharing contracts, which in fact will set forth certain guidelines. Now, the legal team might kick in saying that, we need to have a certain indemnity in the event of a data breach happening. Now, is it going to be one time, two times, or indefinite indemnity? Basis on the strength of the controls and ethics and the compliance that the third party has. Now, that is a call that both the legal teams between the partners as well as the bank or the organization, which is the primary processor of data and the controller of the data, will have to take. And if we move to the data governance aspect, Shomik, sorry, how much time do we have left?
Yeah, we got an excess of 20 minutes, so we're good with that. We also got a lot of questions pouring in, Tejasvi, very interesting ones, which I am going to table. So I want to leave sufficient time for that as well.
Got it. Sure. So I'll go ahead with these aspects quickly, the rest of the aspects, and we can get to the questions, Sean.
Yeah.
So the next aspect is data governance, which in fact has a profound impact on the data trust within the organization. Now, we have a data trust framework even within HDFC. Well, I wouldn't quote HDFC because that's the organization I'm working with currently, and it's considered an IP for us.
Yeah. Okay.
And having to understand the trust associated with a specific set of data, be it customer data or finance data, is important not only for internal consumers like operations team or product team or finance team. It's also important for our extended stakeholders the shareholders. Don't you think that the shareholders will have to be given that confidence that data within an organization is trustworthy?
100%. Yeah.
And that's where I think I would want to specifically call out that data trust will have to have a profound connection with corporate governance principles, which is manifesting in most of the banks today. We are getting to connect the dots between data trust as well as corporate governance and ESG, which was our earlier aspect we discussed on. And quality of data and accuracy of the data, in fact, dovetails into the data trust that an organization defines. Now, data trust can be all about having to understand the accuracy of particular data domain, like customer data. How do the internal consumers perceive the quality of the data to be? Do they have to spend time on having to reassess the quality of data, let's say for customer name or a date of birth? Or they trust whatever the upstream producer is producing today? Is there a specific contract to be able to call out the data is 99% accurate? Now, this defines what is a data trust.
Okay.
Now, coming to the next aspect, privacy classifications. So, basis the sensitivity of the data and the sensitivity of data. Now, data can be classified into personal data or sensitive personal data, which, as per DPDPA, we are not accounting for. As per the earlier IT Act, we had two classifications. So most of the banks will have two classifications. We're getting to a singular classification now.
Okay.
And we have certain tools like the data discovery tool, which we talked about earlier, the Informatica's, IBM's of the world, or Colibra or Elation, which in fact can classify data. They can have certain rules which are repeatable, which we call as regex expressions. Quite familiar. If we are quite familiar with Java, it's easy for us to codify a regex expression to call out that it's an Aadhaar number, or it's a PAN number of a customer, or it's a customer name. And having to identify certain thresholds, which can automatically classify data as PAN numbers in this example, will reduce the effort of privacy analysts or data analysts to go through it manually and classify them as either PAN numbers or Aadhaar numbers or any of the other OVDs. So that's privacy classification. And that's an important aspect of the process that needs to be done as a part of data governance and privacy management.
Right.
Now, the next aspect is technology. When we were referring to the risk management or risk associated with assets, having to discover the applications which are critical for the organization's data processing and critical for the customers, and having to ensure that there is an inventory of all assets is quite important. Now, when we talk about critical assets, they can be the core banking solutions. You might be processing liabilities through a particular core banking system, assets to another core banking system. Now, mutual funds and wealth customers are being serviced through another core banking. So these core banking systems will have to be given a certain criticality basis the impact that they have on transactions of the customers or the service that you provide to the customers.
Right.
Now, there can be lots of peripheral systems which support the customers in this journey of servicing them around. Need to be discovered because data is being exchanged actively between the peripheral systems and the core banking systems, which in fact means that there is risk associated with each of these systems that needs to be captured and managed actively. Now, even a regulator is going to ask for a categorization of each of these applications basis the risk that the data that each of the system possesses has as a risk for the bank or the customers.
Mhm.
I'm sure that you would have had these conversations. So it's a best practice to be able to have a mechanism to classify applications for criticality, and specifically the data platforms like the data lake,
Right.
or let's say a data warehouse or a customer master data management solution. or a reference data management solution, or a CRM, or an ERP, which processes customer data at scale, these need to be actively governed and managed. When I say these platforms need to be governed, which means that they need to be governed for uptime. You need to have them available for at least 99.9% of the time.
Right.
Because you'll be processing regulatory returns from these systems. There'll be around 65,000 returns that any bank produces to the regulator. There'll be operational decisions that will be taken basis operational reports. Now, this necessitates that the platform has a good uptime,
Right.
and it is also able to process data at scale without having a downtime in between. And further to that, it's able to be nimble in terms of having to integrate further certain new reports or certain new models that are getting created, which in fact is a scalability aspect of it. So
Right.
all these non-functional requirements, in fact, need to be taken into consideration on the platform governance aspect. And coming to the next aspect of processes and controllers being associated with data contracts. Now, data contract is a formal mechanism which we have been seeing from the last year.
Right.
I would say that um, it's fresh. It's quite hot off the barbecue or how it. But how many are getting to implement it is still a question. Most of the contracts today are probably paper documents which are being signed by legal departments of, let's say, both organizations. But we have seen technology having to evolve to seamlessly translate these paper contracts on what data is being shared. What are the controls that both the parties are getting to implement? What is the indemnity associated with each of these data points which are being shared in the event of a breach happening? And how are the parties being certified for their security risks? Are they SOC 2 Type 2 compliant if you're talking about a cloud provider?
Mhm.
So these are all questions that need to be baked in as responses in the contract. And the contract, in fact, is a piece of a transformation which can readily be put across into a platform. So let's say we have certain data contracts like Informatica Marketplace.
Mhm.
And very recently, I think I heard a CDO saying that he's very much interested uh, as a pharmaceutical firm,
Okay.
as he contracts with multiple partners for equipment. Um, it's quite important for him to have a contract on whatever data is being shared and whatever equipment is being shared, along with the quality of the equipment. So he said that he wants to have a technology solution that can translate these contracts immediately into, let's say, a data copy agreement, which can put data from point A to point B in a data warehouse.
Right.
And this is all feasible with the data contracts, and the data sharing and lifecycle management is quite important as well. And similarly, privacy management, I wouldn't take much time on this because most of us by now are familiar with what a consent means. A consent is nothing but a preference of a customer on how data needs to be processed, where the customer is comfortable having to say that, certain set of data can be processed for marketing need,
Yeah.
or let's say upselling or cross-selling, or receiving certain mailers on, let's say, next best offers. So it's all about preference management.
Right.
And we also see that, preferences can also come from regulations from TRI, which in fact are something like D&D.
Right.
A customer might not be interested in having to get a communication from an organization. And he or she can go for a D&D. But however, how does this dovetail into the customer preference management that the bank or an organization is putting in place? So that is a thought which needs to be solutioned by the privacy office along with the data office and the business divisions. I think that's food for thought. I'm not answering it here.
All right.
And the next aspect in the process for privacy management is having to understand the purpose for which data is being collected and processed. That's important to be taken up as a part of the privacy impact assessment, which in fact most of us would have started with. And the next aspect in privacy management associated with technology is how are we getting to understand who within the organization is supposed to access a date of birth of a customer?
Right.
Is it open for everyone to consume? Or do we have to give certain rights to a data owner who is a business owner to call out who is supposed to access date of births of a liability customer? So this is what we call as entitlements. So these
You recommend,
entitlements,
would you recommend, an approach of least privilege at this, for this particular aspect?
yeah, in fact, when it comes to tooling, Shomik, Big ID has certain capabilities around entitlement management.
Mhm.
I have been speaking to CEOs of other firms to be able to bring this capability to other tools as well.
Okay.
Uh, just I've been speaking to Stan from Colibra. Um, Forgot the name of the CEO for Big ID. He just texted me saying that this is something we spoke about 3 years ago.
Mhm.
We're going to go live with this. So certain tools, I'm sure, have these capabilities. I might not know all the capabilities of the tools out there, but I'm sure that some of them might have these capabilities of access control requirements, which
Right.
we popularly call as entitlements. And if a tool is able to translate these requirements for access controls into readily translatable, technology controls, if I'm getting to access a date of birth of customer, I should not be allowed to unless I have a purpose that is approved by a data owner.
Right.
And
Understood. Right. And I think the data governance part, especially for the banking space, makes a lot of sense. We recently saw one of India's top five banks getting penalized by the RBI, in addition to one of the cooperative banks. We also have a huge penalty of 250 crores that could be applicable for failure to enforce the adequate cybersecurity measures. So I think yes, this is a great framework, and thank you so much for sharing this with us, Tejasvi. Now, Tejasvi, in the interest of time, I'm going to club a couple of questions. And in your experience, not just in the banking sector, but then you've worked with the other firms as well, and also through conversations with other IT leaders, what are some of the common mistakes that companies tend to make when it comes to addressing data management, especially translating it into risk? And also, um, what is your approach when you're trying to onboard solutions, technology solutions to manage your risk? What are some of the things that you bear in mind? What's been successful for you?
sure, Soman. So I'll take the first question. My first bank that I got into in India is Axis Bank. Earlier, I was in California, London, Edinburgh, Sydney, Vietnam. While while I picked up an Indian bank, I was expecting, the geographical resemblance to probably the Asian banks.
Right.
But I think specifically when we put Indian banks into context or Indian organizations into context, what suits us better in terms of data management is to start off with the CIO as well as the CTO being an active part of owning that function.
Okay.
And when there is, let's say, a policy being established or repeatable activities to get to consistently managing data, then this particular division or a function of a data office can be moved to the business or the first line of defense,
Okay.
because we are moving the entire industry to a narrative that data needs to be owned by a business owner. When there is sufficient tech as well as maturity in terms of process available, the seamless movement from IT to business can happen.
Right.
And that is the same approach which I have taken even with Axis Bank. And with HDFC as such, just my personal thoughts, I think we are a step ahead in terms of having to have this within the business division already. which is the first line of defense, which means that there is significant awareness in the organization on having to actively manage data and govern it. So I would say that, maturity of the organization will have to be taken into the consideration before taking a call on where to formalize a function like data management. But nevertheless, we can start off with best practices. If the board is waiting for some time to have certain awareness in the employees on managing data, best practices, in fact, is a good way to present, better ways of managing data and data privacy as well. Now that we have a regulation for privacy, I know most of your boards will be aligned to having a policy, available out there to provide guidelines or to provide these repeatable steps to every employee out there in the organization to manage customer privacy. Shomik, sorry, the second question, can you please repeat that for me?
The second is, when you're trying to onboard technology solutions to manage your, risks, what are some of the things that you look for? What are some of, do you have a checklist that has contributed to your success when it comes to onboarding new technologies?
Yep, and that's an important question if you ask me. And that is where we have a science of platform governance in place, which is of data governance and technology.
Right.
If we're going to onboard a new customer master data management solution, whether this is going to uniquely identify a customer, are you going to give a customer ID basis uniquely identifying a customer, which we call as a CRN, or a customer ID that is a single identifier that is used by a customer when he steps into a store or a branch of a bank.
Right.
Now, if that is a use case or a scenario for an MDM, you will have to put it far left when data is being curated. And if the purpose is having to convolute all the data from multiple systems and having to service the customer, which is towards a customer life cycle, which is towards the end of the customer life cycle after onboarding the customer, then a customer master can come towards the far right.
Right.
Towards the consumption landscape. So the needs analysis, which we were talking about earlier, which is data governance and privacy by design, is an important precursor even before we get to execute a checklist of what are those important aspects that a platform needs to have. Do I need to have a 99.9% uptime on the platform, or can I live with 99% uptime? Does there need to be a backup always available? Does data need to be repeatable on the fly like a Kafka? What if data is not available, let's say for a brief moment? Can we still initiate the processing after data is available? And what kind of customer scale are we looking at in the next year, 2 years, 3 years, or 5 years? Can the platform be expanded to be able to cater to customer growth? Right. Now, these are certain non-functional requirements which can come out in the checklist that need to be, actively looked at by the platform owner as well as the change owner to be able to get a good platform. Because if you're getting a platform today, you don't want to call it a sunk cost next year. You'll have to look at certain integration capabilities for the future tech. We're talking about quantum computing and various levels of encryption that are going to, change the way that, we are looking at securing data.
True.
These aspects, can the platform support these aspects? Now, these are some of the questions which in fact need to be asked as part of the checklist for platform governance. Now, if you look at certain tools like Mega or Spark, now these tools have, some of these questions already baked in, which can be easily asked to a change owner. So that's my initial few thoughts, Sean.
Got it. Thanks. And audience, I hope you were taking notes. Those were some brilliant points, especially, when you're trying to account for technological advances in cryptography, quantum computing, and of course, seeing the number of mergers and acquisitions we see in the BFSI space. Very pertinent points there. Thank you so much for that, Tejasvi. Now, that brings us to the audience questions. For the first one, I'd like to take up one from UAE. We have Gopi Maran here, who is asking us how to establish a data office in organizations with less exposure on data management best practices. Especially, how do you get the buy-in from the business?
Yeah, that's an intriguing question always whenever we hear it, and we hear it always. So
Mhm.
that's a great question, Gopi. And I would start off by having to say that if the maturity of the organization is very low in terms of having to consider data as an asset, probably it is not highly regulated, because regulations have in fact been able to limit the need of having to actively manage data. Now, when we consider a manufacturing or a retail uh, organization, for example, they might not be heavily regulated around data, but where data needs to be actively managed for them is their top line as well as their operational revenue is dependent on the accuracy of the data that they're processing, because they're taking operational decisions basis the insights that are generated from data. So the risk, in fact, of not having to take these decisions in a right way is going to impact the future sustainability of the organization. And that's where the ESG and the corporate governance perspective kicks in for data being managed actively. Now, for these set of organizations which are not heavily regulated,
Mhm.
it's important to be able to bring in that awareness at least for an year and a half, to be able to say that, why does quality of data need to be maintained? If not a sigma like how banks are doing it, or how
Mhm.
I popularly do it, or how the Toyotas of the world do it, it's important to call out that, there is a common yardstick, which in fact can be used to measure the quality of the data. Now, how is the quality of the data impacting the balance sheet?
Right.
Is it impacting, you know, probably let's take an example of a firm which in fact is shipping containers and shipping goods.
Okay.
When I was speaking with one of the CDOs of a supply chain organization, his biggest challenge was having to effectively utilize the space in a container that goes on a ship. And probably, he was not able to do it because he doesn't have access to real-time data, which can in fact help him stack, the goods in a way that, it optimizes space.
Right. Right.
And the time that, it takes for a customer to book an order, and the goods being placed in the container and shipped off is significant. There is significant turnaround time. All of this, when they analyze the root cause of the challenge with the customer uh, turnaround time, or the turnaround time for shipping goods, they got to know that it's lack of real-time data. So connecting the business impact with lack of management of data or lack of access to data is probably the first business case that a data function can put in place to be
Right.
able to secure funding, to put people, process, best practices, and tooling in place. So that's my few cents.
Got it. Okay.
Maulik.
Thank you for that. And yeah, I mean, logistics industry, of course, they've got their whole set of challenges, but then yeah, it's pretty applicable to almost all your verticals that we have here. Let's quickly move on to Devashish Rai's question. Now, Devashish asks us, uh, how does the DPDP Act strategy get implemented across industries? So, in your opinion, which category of industry or institutions will be the first line of rollouts, and how will they align the designation, like the DPDPO in the business line?
Well, that's a great question. If you ask me who are the forward movers
Hmm.
with the DPDP, I would definitely call out the banks, that because I'm personally working with a bank which in fact has progressively started having to tackle these requirements even before the rules are in place. While we are expecting the rules to be in place, the basic framework and the guidelines are something that are already available for us to start putting together a framework to start off with. As simple as what data is personal to customers, where is it being stored, how many applications have the same data, what are the levels of controls, be it privacy controls like consents, or security controls like anonymization, masking, encryption, that are available. Now, these are certain aspects which can be harmonized by asking the same question across to multiple business units.
Mhm.
And when there is collective response from various units, business divisions, and the privacy officer having to look at it, there is a singular view of, what is the strength of this particular organization and where in fact certain weaknesses need to be plugged. In risk terms, we call it strength of controls, strength of compensatory controls, which
Right.
defines the inherent risk that a particular domain or a risk has. Um, so this is something which is important, which every privacy officer can start off with. Banks definitely are in a better place because there are already regulations in place from the as best practices from the regulators in terms of inventorying data.
Right.
So, RBI in simple sense asks us, to create a catalog of data. We just need to extend it to say that, this is personal data. Date of birth is personal data. Age is personal data, which is derived from date of birth. Even though age is derived from date of birth, it is personal to the customer. So it's personal as well. So it becomes easier for us to extend on whatever regulations and guidelines have been put across by RBI. Now the same can be said about insurance as well from IRDA, mutual funds and trading from SEBI, pharmaceuticals as well are heavily regulated in terms of sharing contracts. Um, and we can see these to be front runners in terms of having to protect customer data as well as to put in privacy control framework as front runners. I hope that answers the question, Shamik.
Absolutely. And what do you foresee? Is it going to be the DPO who's going to be the flag bearer of DPDP implementation across industries?
Absolutely. The data privacy and the protection officer is going to be the flag bearer.
Mhm.
Fortunately, unfortunately, the privacy officer will be bearing the indemnity
Okay.
of a privacy risk manifesting. But however, I think GDPR says that, which is a part of the European regulation, um, gives a higher accountability in terms of um, putting the DPO behind the bars, even if it comes to it. But I don't think, that level of indemnity exists for a DPO in India.
Got it. All right. With that, we come to one of the last questions. That's from DK Soni. And DK Soni asks us the request response phenomenon needs scope of safety for data format of all modules of storage, retrieval, and operations. What about running and upcoming formats and scope of risk and endowment practices? And I think that's quite relevant, considering we are seeing the possible onboarding of Avro, ORC, Paraquet coming up. What's your
Yeah.
view on this?
Well, I think having to process unstructured data is still a biggest threat, if you ask me. We're talking about voice, we're talking about video,
Yeah,
and most of it getting converted into embeddings in the large language models. Then this data getting processed to answer certain questions. I can ask a question today saying that who walked into an ATM that is there on MG Road? I can get a straight answer saying that it's a male or it's a female. Now this is the level to which large language models have evolved, and having to call out which data is personal even in unstructured format becomes
right.
all the more important. And that's where the discovery tools will have to start evolving.
Exactly.
And some of them, I think, have certain capabilities, but even the organizations will have to test them out and see if the right kind of classification is being attributed. And I mean, we can take an example of a Swift message. A
Mhm.
Swift message, in fact, can have personal data, be it personal data of the customer transacting. It can be the amount, which is a financial value.
Okay.
Now, while we can overlay a specific format to a Swift message, it becomes important to be able to classify which is financial data, which is personal data of customer, is the point of origin of a transaction personal to the customer. Can we call it out that way? So the format, all the more, is quite important, and the tools as well as the privacy officers will have to start evolving to be able to cater to classification of that as well, and protecting that particular information in unstructured format.
Got it. Absolutely. And yeah, very pertinent point there. I mean, considering that, a lot of KYC data is sometimes stored as JPEG images, although they might contain Aadhaar numbers or, full names and bank addresses, etc. All right. Sainath is asking us, hi, sir, will you be sharing this framework? Are you open to sharing this framework at this point in time, Tejasvi?
Yeah, Shomik, I think if you're able to share it across, even I'm okay with that.
Okay. All right, folks. So you can take a snapshot of this. We don't have a link, unfortunately, we can share with you, but then you can take a snapshot or a screenshot of this. But then if you're using it for any kind of publication, please do attribute this to Tejasvi. A lot of work has gone into this. So please ensure that you attribute and he's okay with you using it. We've got a quick follow-up question from Devashish as well. And that's the last question I'm going to take from you. He's asking us that bank and financial institutions are well placed because they have a governance policy frameworks in place. What about some of the other verticals that do not have GDPR capabilities or DPDPA understanding? What's their way? What's their right approach to it?
Well, that's an interesting question, which in fact I think MSMEs are even having today. I think when we look at the big four, like Deloitte's, KPMG's, PwC's, EY's, as well as boutique firms, we see that privacy is being offered as a service,
Right.
and that in fact is a nimble way of having to actively manage customer data along with purposes and preferences of their personal data in the way that it is being processed. Well, it need not be so costly that you have a dedicated team from a big four or a boutique firm who are there along with you to be able to get this right for you, right from the privacy impact assessment, and
Right.
having to put these controls in place. There are shared services today, which is privacy as a service, which I think even when I was at the ETCIO event in Goa, I specifically remember one of the organization having to call out that they're innovating in a way that they can provide privacy as a service.
Right. True.
I can't remember it right off the bat. What's the name of this firm? But everyone is coming up with this. This is a nimble way of having to ensure that you're compliant with whatever the regulatory guidance is. But more importantly, please look at privacy as a way of having to service your customers better in a way that the customers as well as your shareholders feel that you're doing it in a way that it's improving the integrity of your organization. So once the customers, extended stakeholders, shareholders feel that you are building a data trust, it becomes even more easier for you to be able to either raise funds or to be able to you know get to the revenue numbers that you're looking at, or to ensure that there is financial stability and sustainability in the future. That's my few thoughts, Shamik, about the question.
All right. Fair enough. With that, we come to the end of the webinar today, folks. I hope you enjoyed this webinar. Well, it started as a webinar, turned out to be a bit of a masterclass with Tejasvi Atagada right there. So thanks again. And you can actually access this webinar in about 4 or 5 days from now. It's going to be on our EDCIO website. Feel free to contact Tejasvi on LinkedIn as well. He's really well connected, and he's got a whole bunch of literature that you can actually access that he keeps sharing from his blog posts and his other LinkedIn articles. So thanks again, Tejasvi. Thanks for your time today. And thanks for sharing your expertise with us. It was a pleasure talking to you.
It was a pleasure, Shamik, having to have you ask me these questions, and the audience as well. Please connect with me on LinkedIn. And I have 2 books which in fact can help you with ready to use frameworks in your organization, be it you're mature or you're starting off with your journeys. They should be able to plummet you with at least 10 to 20% of having your functions formalized. And please feel free to drop me a message on LinkedIn. I should be happy to chat with you over the weekends.
All right, folks. So those books are available in Kindle as well as paperback forms. So do give it a look. Thanks again for tuning in, folks. It was great hosting this webinar for us. All right. So have a great evening and have a great weekend ahead. Take care.
Thank you. Take care.
Thanks. Bye.
Bye.